This is Psych Overflow, coming to you from the University of Southern California Psychology Department.
We are your go-to podcast for all things psychology.
Welcome. Let's dive in. Greetings. My name is Gabe León. I'm a third-year PhD student here in the clinical psychology program at USC. This is one of the first podcast recordings with the Climate Curriculum and Training Committee. Today's theme, or topic, I should say, is imposter syndrome. We wanted to just chat about how it's shown up, I guess, in our academic journeys and just offer our reflections. So with me today is Miss Anh Dao and Phil Newsome. I'm going to toss it to them so that they can introduce themselves, and then we'll get into today's chat. So, Anh, I'll toss it to you.
Right. Thanks, Gabe. So my name is Anh Dao. I'm a first-year clinical science student here at USC as well, and I work with Dr. Ione Azawa.
All right. I am also a first-year clinical science PhD student at USC, and I work with Darby Zaxby. Me and Gabe are in the same lab.
Mm-hmm. I forgot to mention that, but we are both a part of the NEST lab, Neuroendocrinology of Social Ties. Great to chat with you guys. This is actually the second iteration of this episode. We had some technical difficulties the first time at the Levy Library Glorious podcast studio, which is slowly ramping up, I guess. I think their infrastructure is still coming into play. But we got some really great help from the homie Lawrence. Shout out Lawrence, the tech guy who's got us all set up. So let's get into it. And I want to really kick it to you because we've had this conversation before on the episode that I mentioned. I just thought a lot of what you had to share was really so powerful. It resonated a lot with me, and I'm sure it resonates a lot with other students too. So do you mind sharing a little bit about your thoughts and experiences with imposter syndrome? And maybe we should define it too. I guess it's a kind of a nebulous term.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea to define it. So imposter syndrome, from my understanding, is kind of a fear of being discovered as a fraud. So basically, you have difficulties internalizing maybe some successes that you have had in the past, and also you worry about others discovering that maybe you don't belong within an academic community or other places. So I think one of the traditions here that we have in the department at USC is the first colloquium of the year. The first year clinical students will sit at the very front of the room while the whole department looks at them. And it's nerve-wracking. And I think the question was for us to ask questions and kind of to get advice from more senior grad students or faculty members, and there was dead silence. So that was terrifying for me. I do not like silence, even though I'm trying to work on it. And so I kind of blurted out a question about imposter syndrome. And that got people really talking. And I think one thing that was really empowering about that is everyone had different strategies about how to deal with those feelings. And I learned a lot from the fellow grad students, but also I really resonated with the fact that almost everyone in the room had something to say. And so it just really illustrated that this is a very common experience. So from my personal experience, I think I was trying to do an honors thesis as a sophomore in college. But then I emailed my advisor, Autumn Kujawa, and I told her, I suck. I do not know anything. I can't do it. I don't belong in the lab. So she, instead of kind of saying much, she just sent me this article about imposter syndrome in the New York Times. And I was really surprised because I never knew that other people felt the same way. And so it was kind of really encouraging to read about that experience that I have not quite been able to put into words through other people's thoughts. So I said to her, great, but I'm still not good enough. So what are you going to do about that? So she suggested that we might want to do a study on imposter syndrome. And that was a really empowering experience because I was able to kind of use my lived experience to better understand something that was really difficult for me, but I also felt like it would be helpful for other students to know that they're not alone in this. And this is quite a common thought pattern and kind of what ways to deal with it.
Yeah, I like what you mentioned. I think your experience really highlights the universality of imposter syndrome and the relatability and how reassuring it can be to know, like for me personally, like know people who I think very highly of, who I think are very talented or hardworking or successful, to hear them say and express their own worries, self-doubt, struggles balancing everything. Like it's like, oh, okay, like this is a part of the process in some ways. And, you know, one can persevere through it. You know, one can persevere and find their footing and find ground and stability as we're trying to like climb and build our own skill sets out. So yeah, I definitely think that's a powerful example of that when you're in a room like that and you break the silence and hear like, oh wow, we actually all share a lot of the same insecurities. Phil, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Well, so I was gonna say one thing that I think is interesting when I was listening to you speak, and I think you didn't say it explicitly, but I think there's another context to imposter syndrome that you highlighted well just by explaining your kind of journey through the academic pipeline. You worked with Dr. Autumn Kujawa at Vanderbilt and then made it to a very competitive clinical psych program. I don't know what the acceptance rate was for our year, but whatever it was. 1%,
highly competitive.
1%,
You guys were
2%, whatever.
highly competitive.
Probably in the most competitive lab where I think Ione probably got, I don't know how many applications, 200 applications, and you were one of the 2 people that got picked. So I think knowing your situation and how qualified you are and how all the physical, tangible things that you've done and that people can see that we're like, she's 101, she's crazy, she's really, really smart. And there's a lot of things that support that. And even knowing all of that, you still have this feeling, and I get it too, where it's like, you know, maybe I'm not supposed to be here. You hear other people's work and it sounds complicated, or it sounds like, oh, they're so much farther than us and they have this many papers. But then we kind of lose all the things that other people might be looking at us and saying, they did this, they worked for this person, they're in this lab. You provided context for the most interesting case of imposter syndrome was with the most successful and highly intelligent people, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, and I think I'd love to hear from both of you. We just kicked off our second semester of 2023, 2024. You guys are in your first year, so this is the midway point. And I'd love to just get a sense of how you guys are doing in navigating the transition to grad school. Obviously, because today's topic is imposter syndrome, what have been some moments of growth you guys have had, or maybe moments of like reassurance in your first year? And yeah, I'd love to just hear kind of how things are going with you guys.
Yeah, I really resonated with what you both just said. I think imposter syndrome is a continuous struggle. You wake up one day and you're like, I got this. I know what I'm doing. And then something happens and I'm like, actually, I don't. So it's definitely, I would say it's something similar to a cognitive bias. Like you interpret your successes in a way that is not really rewarding to you. And that's why it's kind of perpetuating that cycle. And so I think what Phil said, having the hard facts that like you did this and you did this that you cannot refute has been really helpful for me going through the first semester in grad school. And I think one thing that actually really helped me, and it may just be because I'm socially awkward, I sometimes just tell people that I'm feeling anxious or this is overwhelming or this is too much or like I don't understand what's going on. And usually more often than not, people validate those feelings. And I think we kind of find that same common ground in suffering sometimes. And so I think building connections through being really vulnerable and being able to share those thoughts has been really helpful for me.
That's awesome. What about you, Phil?
Yeah, kind of echo everything Anne's been saying. I guess the thing I'll add is maybe that's adding to imposter syndrome a bit, is going into a system, whether it be academia or anything, and there being like clear cultural, even racial, ethnic distinctions between you and other people in the program or other people that you're surrounded by, and that kind of adding fuel to that fire. So that's something that I think I probably wrestle with kind of throughout my journey through the academic pipeline. And I know that you've wrestled with it as well from the conversations that we've had and things that you've talked about. So that's just another thing I'll add. But yeah, I think in terms of overcoming it, I think I try to, I wouldn't say not care as much, but I think it's like taking a really large step back sometimes and being like, the problems I'm having are the things that I'm thinking comparatively. They're so minor. I'm feeling like I don't fit into this highly elite group. I'm probably okay if I'm already there. So taking a step back and like kind of just being like, everything's okay. You're in a program. You're learning a lot. People seem to be nice. And even if the worst case scenario, all these negative thoughts you have about your situation happen to be true, you're probably still in an amazing situation comparatively to other people. So I guess I do that a lot, where I'm just like, stop feeling sorry for yourself. This is an amazing opportunity you have.
Yeah, kind of adding some perspective. But still, though, I mean, I imagine that still doesn't detract from the feelings, right? Especially if there's chronic, perhaps reminders or instances of like, oh man, I'm different in this way. Or like, oh, there's another way that I don't feel connected to my peers in this way. I'm sure that still becomes wearisome, even with those like reminders of gaining perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know if it's in the scope of this podcast, but we could talk about even more specifics about what things really like drive our imposter syndrome in one way or another. But yeah, I think to your point, clearly, like, there's reinforcement both ways. I get reinforced that I'm great and I'm smart, and that I'm doing good things. But just as much, I get, if not more, I get reinforced that I might be somewhat less than, or I might be somewhat inferior to other people that are in a similar position.
Yeah. And what about you? Thoughts or similar experiences? I'd love to hear from you as well on this topic.
Yeah, so I think one thing I have really struggled with is that my family is all the way in Vietnam. So I feel like not only I'm distant from them physically, but also in terms of what I do, because first generation college student, so my parents have no idea what I'm doing. So sometimes it's like, oh, I wish, I had that kind of support from my parents. But in terms of our cohort and the program, I think I've had really great experiences of being able to share my concerns, especially with my current advisor, Ione. So that has been really helpful. But also, I am kind of reading this book on acceptance and commitment therapy. And one of the points they're making is that your mind isn't always your friend. And that took me a really long time to really start to believe, because I was like, how is my mind not my friend when it's my mind? But even just today, we just had a meeting with the second year students talking about our milestone. And I was like, I'm so dumb. I'm never going to get this finished. Like, I can't do this. And I was like, well, it hasn't happened yet. So I can definitely tell it's just my mind being anxious. And it's not doing anything wrong per se, but it's just preparing for me to work hard.
Yeah, I love how even in that example, in keeping with the way acceptance and commitment therapy approaches mental health and thoughts, like you were able to kind of get some distance from that thought that your mind put out there of like, oh, I'll never get this done. This isn't going to happen, right? You were able to be like, okay, hold on. Like, this is what my mind's saying, right? But may not be completely true, right? May not be accurate or may not be helpful, right? It sounds like you're able to get some distance from that thought in that moment.
Yeah, I think that's why I really like research. I think it's kind of like a metaphor for my life. I feel like I'm never sure that I know something or that I know for sure this is going to succeed, but I try anyway. And I think that's really how I came to really like research so much, is that you keep questioning those thoughts, and instead of like accepting that, yeah, maybe I'm not as smart as I think, but that doesn't mean that I can't do something that I want to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. One thing that you mentioned that I wanted to come back to is, I don't know if there's a term for it, but I felt it too in certain ways. I'm sure experiences as an international student are different than mine, I'm sure. Like, I'm born and raised in New Mexico, but, like the family I come from, I'm the first in my family to go to college and all that stuff, right? So there's this like separation between what's important, like everything that is important here in this PhD program and what is concerning to my lab or my clinical work. It's like totally irrelevant to folks back home, like couldn't be less important. Like for all intents and purposes, they have no idea what I do. For all intents and purposes, they think, I'm spending, 40 to 60 hours a week doing God knows what, right? And it's so weird. And then the inverse is also true, right? So like if my family's going through something or I'm trying to support them in a certain way, which I love doing because they're the people that I care about, that also too it doesn't pertain at all to what's going on in the PhD program, right? So it's a weird kind of like double experience, and I'm sure everyone goes through it in various ways, shapes, and forms, but it is something that I feel like I've felt a lot, especially in anytime taking trips back home. It's like, okay, now I'm in this separate mode of being, and then when I'm back here, it's like a totally different switch. Yeah, I don't know if you guys feel that as well or relate to it.
Well, I was going to just ask, when you go back home, because I know my parents do this too, they don't really have an understanding of what's going on or what I study or whatever. So kind of like, one, do your parents or do your family back home attempt to like ask you questions or make inferences about what you do when you go back home? And then two, how much or how little do you give them? Because I feel like sometimes with me, I'll kind of say something super simple because I don't think talking about what I do might be interesting or might be relevant to anything they care about.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I try to contextualize it, right? I think the clinical stuff's probably more interesting, right? So like I'm very fortunate to be able to help co-facilitate a parenting group at Homeboy Industries, which is a very well-known gang rehabilitation center here in LA. And a lot of the folks that I get to meet there, I feel like there's a lot of relatability to folks that my mom grew up around or my sister grew up around. So I can share those experiences with them, and it does seem to really resonate. But some other parts of the process, like research parts and data analysis and describing what a manuscript is and research journal articles, there's a gap there that I'm like, you know what? I think I'll leave this be. I'll say like I'm doing some writing, right? Or I'm just doing some work on the computer, right?
Has your family attempted to read one of your manuscripts?
Oh no, maybe I don't know. I think they may have opened a PDF at one point in time, but yeah, it's just so funny. It's just so funny how the work, and this is not just common to I think my family, but just in general, the work of an academic can be totally hard to understand, and I get it, but yeah, it's just really weird. Whereas if you tell someone like you're a lawyer or you're in med school, oh wow, it's so great, right? It's like, oh no, I'm doing a PhD in psychology. It's like, so you don't have a job, huh? So when are you gonna start making money, right? But I digress. Other thoughts on imposter syndrome or other reflections from the first year? I'd love to hear if you guys have anything else to share.
I think we touched a little bit upon this, but maybe like thinking about how you basically find belonging within academia and your family. I feel like sometimes when I go home, my mom is like, you're a completely different person when you're home because I don't know anything that's going on in Vietnam anymore. But when I'm here, I'm always like thinking about what my family's doing home. So I was just wondering if both of you had any kind of strategies, or I forgot what that word is pronounced, but ways you find your own belonging wherever you are. And I think that's still related to imposter syndrome as well.
Phil, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I think maybe this gets at kind of what you're saying. I think a strategy that I kind of maintained since starting is making sure that I stay connected. Just calling, FaceTiming, those kind of things. Like I try to check in and see how everybody's doing. On the one hand, I think they appreciate that because I feel like sometimes they're like, oh, aside from me moving to actually do research and go to get my PhD or whatever, like, oh, he moved to Los Angeles. He forgot about us in PG, Maryland. But so I call back and make sure that they know that I'm still thinking about them and care about them. And also, yeah, it fulfills me as well, making sure that I'm staying connected. And like I moved out here with very little social connections outside of the program, basically. So yeah, I think that's one thing. I just keep being in contact. I don't know. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think what I've learned, particularly this year, because I think last semester I had a hard time managing my time as effectively as I wanted to. And I noticed that when that happens, right? So I have work-related stress that just spills over, right, into like my other relationships or whatever. This may not apply, but for me, I had to understand that I need to look myself in the mirror and be like, I need to organize a set of responsibilities that I think I can do well, right? Not do too much, but the things that I do put on my plate, I want to do those things well. And if I do that, it's not just going to help me like advance in my PhD or whatever, but it's actually going to help me show up better for the people that I care about. So I'm doing them a service by managing my time well. It applies to clinical work too, right? Like there was times I think, and it always happens, but you're just like, man, like I'm not showing up 100% for my client today, right? And I'm like, dang, man, and it's not fair to them, right? It's like that's a responsibility that I want to uphold to. And so I've tried to put together better planning, a better system to make that happen. And like during break, for example, I tried to really take certain days where I like wouldn't even think about work, wouldn't even think about doing anything related to it, and just be more present with family, extended family that I don't get to see that often, and just try to be a little bit more generous on my time. And I feel like that actually, it's like a feed forward loop in a way, where if I feel like my time outside of work is more consistent with what I care about, you know, the people that I love, I come back to work more energized, and then I can, you know, manage my time effectively, and then, you know, have more time to spend doing things outside of work. So I don't know if that relates to belongingness, but it does help me to be present when I'm, you know, with the people that I care about. And in academia, the belongingness piece, like, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of thoughts on that, but for me, I've just come to realize that I got to be honest and accountable to the responsibilities that I take on. If I take on too many, that's on me. It's not anyone else. You know, if I'm taking on too many and not able to show up for the things that I have put on my plate, that's on me. I can't point the finger. So for what it's worth, those are like some of my reflections. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing I really like about clinical psychology is that we learn about kind of different ways to manage our time, but also we have a chance to both apply it in therapy settings with clients, but also ourselves, which is something I think really unique, but I definitely relate. It feels like I never learn. I start to cancel my calls with my friends. I start to not talk to my parents. I'm like, why do I feel sad? Like, that's so surprising. And it's always a good learning experience to kind of recalibrate and restart and rethink my priorities and how academia is really a marathon, not a sprint. But yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That statement, academia is a marathon, not a sprint, I've had to really learn that the hard way in many ways. But yeah, we put arbitrary, I think, expectations on ourselves to get to a certain spot by a certain time. It's like, nah, man, it's like, find a pace that works for each of us. That's what's going to have us get through it and thrive. But one other thing, and this could be another podcast episode in and of itself, but just as clinical students going through the process of learning how to help other people with what they're going through, while simultaneously learning how we can apply aspects of the interventions that we're learning to what we're going through. I think that's like a cool topic in and of itself. I thought about it. I'll put a pin in that. That'll be the cliffhanger, I guess. But yeah, any other thoughts, guys, before we wrap for today?
I'll do one more quick thought kind
Sure.
of about what you were just saying, because I think it ties back to the beginning of the podcast really nicely. The fact that we have obviously milestones and deadlines, but we also put arbitrary milestones and deadlines on ourselves. But I think part of that is the constant seeking or constant trying to relieve the feeling of not doing enough, or somebody else maybe like doing something better, doing something more, and that like kind of feeding into your imposter syndrome. So like we're constantly looking for ways to give us those like tangibles that are like telling us or reinforcing to us like, you know, you are good enough, you are fine, and this is why, because I just got this paper out, because I was the first person to do this, or I just did this. And I think all of it's kind of connected, like putting those kind of things on ourselves is like just us trying to prove to people and to a sense that we belong here and that we fit and that, you know, we're in the program for a reason and we didn't just get in because of, you know, I don't know. I have my own thoughts about why I might have gotten, but maybe another podcast too.
Right.
Yeah, there's so many things to talk about, but I really like what you both said, and I think one thing that I get caught up on when I'm like, oh, I need to publish this paper, I need to get this done. I forget about my why. And I think it always helps to kind of recenter myself. I think about why I decided to do this in the first place. And even though I may not be, I guess, the best person in the room, I think just contributing anything to the cause has been really helpful for me to realize that.
Absolutely. I mean, you guys put like 5 more thoughts in my head, but I'll try to keep it brief. I wish I could give this person credit. I heard this quote in the past couple of years, and it really stuck with me, which is the end product of your PhD is not the degree, and it's not your CV, it's you. Like, we are the end product. And that really stuck out to me because it made me realize that it's like, okay, my job here is to develop myself into someone who's a better critical thinker, a better analyst, a better knowledge expert in the things that I, claim to have expertise in. And I was like, oh, okay. So if that's the goal, then it doesn't matter like how I stack up against someone else who's also in that same pursuit. It doesn't matter if I publish X amount of papers and the next person publishes X times 2. It really doesn't. Like, it's just, well, how developed am I as researcher and as a clinician? And I'm like, oh, okay. So I don't have to worry about the CV and all the deliverables. Like, that'll just be a byproduct of that initial pursuit, which is I want to just know my stuff, right? I want to be able to think critically and mentor students and teach and articulate my ideas and back them up with evidence and implement evidence-based interventions in a way that meets people where they're at. When I'm in that headspace, I feel like I have much more peace of mind, right? But as soon as I get pulled back into that headspace of like, oh man, I'm behind, or my advisor's disappointed in me, or dang, this other person's just like kicking ass and I'm not, I get so unhappy and everything is begrudging. Everything's like, it's just less fun. But when I have that mentality of like, you know what, this is process of developing, it's slow, steady progress. It's like, I found myself motivated there. But that was like my last thought. All right, guys, I think we are at time, but I appreciate you both being here. Hopefully this is one of many more podcasts to come. Mm-hmm. And I would thank everyone for listening.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
This is Psych Overflow signing off. Thank you for listening.
Be sure to subscribe to our podcast for future episodes, and don't hesitate to reach out to us with your feedback, questions, or topic suggestions.
See you next time.